All right, so we're starting section 2 of chapter 1, part 2 of on the mode of existence of technical objects. So we did the end of, or we did the introduction to the part last time, and then section 1 of the first chapter. So now we're going to start on section 2 and see how far we get. I'm not sure we'll be able to finish the whole chapter today. We'll see. So I'll start reading and then we'll just go around. Section 2, the phase shift from the primitive magical unity. It is therefore necessary to begin with the primitive magical unity of the relations of man and the world in order to understand the true relation of technics to the other functions of human thought. It is through this examination that it is possible to grasp why philosophical thought must realize the integration of the reality of technics into culture, which is possible only by revealing the sense of the genesis of technics through the foundation of a technology. It is only then that the disparity between technics and religion will be attenuated, which is detrimental to the intention of a reflexive synthesis of knowledge and ethics. Philosophy must found technology, which is the ecumenism of technics, for the sciences and ethics to be able to meet in reflection. The unity of technics and the unity of religious thought must precede the splitting of each of these forms of thought into a theoretical mode and a practical mode. So this is just continuing off of what we saw last time about the series of different modes of existence that are generated through these splits into form and ground or background, or however you want to translate phone. So he argues about that in order for this split to be compatible with the unity of human existence as a whole, and there has to be a contrary tendency towards reuniting the activities that are split into the form and ground. So each stage of the split is accompanied by a stage of reunification that follows it. And he argues that philosophy is the sort of the last stage of reunification. So if we have that diagram that we had last week, philosophy unites right at the bottom of that diagram, if I can bring it up. Yeah, so philosophy is uniting all of the different activities because it's coming at the last stage of the differentiation process. And then here in particular in this paragraph, he's pointing out, he's arguing that there's a need for a technology in the sense of a study of techniques and a grasping of the sense of the genesis of techniques in order to be able to found philosophy as a discipline that will unite techniques and religion, so that it will overcome the fundamental dichotomy or the first split in the modes of existence. And then philosophy will be philosophy requires that technology to exist in order for it to be able to carry out that unification.
I'd be curious to know what people think just off the top here about whether it's the case that a reunification would be something like the reunification of like political theory and sociology with technology, in the sense of like analytic social science or something as it gets projected into computers, or whether we'd be more prone to sort of read the religion side as something like ideology, in the sense of, you know, downloadable consciousness and the ways that we're talking about artificial intelligence and so on and so forth as a kind of magical sort of throwing forward of humankind. Just whether people are reading religion as a kind of reading that side as a kind of increasing secularization, or whether it's one of these things where a kind of magical reading of technology is always sort of co-present with the technology.
That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. I would say so. He emphasized in the last section that each of these differentiations leaves something behind of the previous level. So when the magic mode of existence splits into religion and technology, or sorry, religion and techniques, that doesn't exhaust the magical mode of existence. There's something of that magical mode that remains, that it isn't exhausted by that split. So I think when he's calling for this reunification of religion and technology, so there's a sense in which here, let me think of what I'm trying to say here.
Maybe the case that we should talk about later or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's possible that we'll sort of come to answer that question as we go through the text. But yeah, I think when he's talking about religion, so there's more development of the concept of religion in the individuation book, and he has a sort of a layered account of religion. It's not like he doesn't have sort of a unificatory account of religion, that religion is this one thing, but he points to different types of religious figures, like the saint or the hero, and they each have sort of different roles and different types of individuation, and so the one I guess point that's interesting in that theory of religion that he develops in that book is the role of the sage. I think we discussed this a little bit a couple weeks ago, but he derives the figure of the sage from technical knowledge, but technical knowledge in the sense that it's treated as a mystery that you have to be initiated into. So this is something that's quite common across societies that have some sort of early class division, or which tends to be realized in the form of guilds or caste system, where you inherit your technical knowledge from your family, or your position within the division of labor from your family, and then technical knowledge is treated as a sort of secret that you have to be initiated into, rather than something that is publicly available for the whole society. And the sage is sort of descended from this figure of the kind of like a wizard who has this technical knowledge that is secret to the rest of society. And the sage, through that technical knowledge that they have, they incorporate, they bring aspects of nature into society. So religion is not a purely social function for Simondon. It's in that figure of the sage, religious activity has some relation to nature outside of society, and the sage brings that aspect of nature into society. And so I think, sorry, that was a little bit of a long explanation, but I think it's connected to your question here, in that when he's talking about religion, it's not something that would be purely at the level of ideology, like at the level of representations or beliefs or something along those lines. Religion is a complex social function that includes a form of relationship to nature in the figure of the sage, as one of the elements of religion, according to Simondon.
That's great. That's good to know that level of depth is functioning in the other book. It's one more reason that I'd want to read it next, for sure. Thanks for the explanation. That's great.
Yeah, there's in the other book, there's like it's a very rich book. There's lots of different elements you can sort of pick up and make connections to other spheres of inquiry. So I'm hoping that October date comes through, unlike the earlier one that I think was in August or something like that they ended up pushing back. But yeah, we'll keep an eye out for that.
For sure.
What's interesting to me about this paragraph is that it's starting with a therefore, which kind of builds on that prior point about the place of philosophical thought for Simondon, and it's kind of like autonomous, kind of like reflexive mode, I guess, that he's kind of using that as a condition for this claim about magic and these foundational claims, right?
Yeah, so I think yeah, so the therefore obviously points back to the previous section, and that that role of philosophy as reflexive thought. So it's there's a genesis of philosophy, like philosophy has a place within the system of the genesis of different modes of existence, but then also philosophy, its role is to grasp that genesis itself. So it's the genesis of modes of thought is what philosophy grasps, and so that's why it's reflexive. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to volunteer.
Sure, I can go. The genesis of a particular phase can be described in itself, but it cannot really be known along with its sense, and consequently grasped in its postulation of unity, unless it is placed back into the totality of the genesis as a phase in relation with other phases. This is why it is insufficient for understanding technics to start from constituted technical objects. Objects appear at a certain moment, but technicity precedes them and goes beyond them. Technical objects result from an objectivation of technicity. They are produced by it, but technicity does not exhaust itself in the objects and is not entirely contained within them.
Right, and this is also a point that he made in the last section as well. And I think I mentioned last time, or drew a connection back to the introduction, where he argues against a theory of technicity that would start from constituted technical objects and then classify them by genus and species. So in the introduction, he just gives a sort of empirical argument for why that doesn't work, because it groups technical objects that have a similar use, but their actual fundamental structure is very different. And then it's technical objects that have a similar fundamental structure will be separated into different categories because they have different uses. So that's just sort of an empirical argument that he presents in the introduction. But then here, in the last section, and then in this paragraph, he gives a more ontological type of argument for why that classification into genus and species is not an effective approach to grasping technicity. So because it's you're only staying at the level of the constituted technical object, it doesn't allow you to grasp the genesis of technicity, which precedes the actual constituted technical object and is more than so there's more to technicity than is realized in the constituted technical object.
This might be as good a place as any to put in a plug for the fact that the Heidegger Basic Writings group next week is doing the question concerning technology. So I figured that this chapter or this segment would probably be talking about that in a certain way, and so I thought I'd throw in the fact that that's going to happen next Friday at 6 Eastern.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. That's useful because I think this. I'd have to look at the years. I'm not sure when that essay came out. It was sometime in the 50s, I think. The Heidegger essay. So it's likely that Simondon was aware of it, and that probably is part of what he's sort of working with or against in this part of the book in particular.
Apparently, it was first given it as the part of the Bremen lectures in 1949.
Okay. The publication I think was a few years after that, though. Like I forget which collection of Heidegger's that it was published in, but and then I'm not sure to what extent Simondon would have read it in German or relied on the translation. So it'd be interesting to look at the publication history and try to trace, whether Simondon would have been available to, would have had available to him the text at the time he's writing this. Right. So, question concerning technology, published in 1953. So that would be several years before, about 5 years before the On the Mode of Technical Existence was published. So there would presumably be lots of time for Simondon to have read that essay. So again, I'm not sure how much he read German. Oh, and so 61 is put in the chat that technicity is not entirely explicable in terms of technical objects seems to be the formative theme of this section. Yeah, so we haven't gotten too far into the section, but that's, or maybe of the part of the book, I would say maybe that's, oh yes, the whole third part, yeah. Yes, I think that's one of the sort of key takeaways. So the first part of the book is sort of an exemplification of what he means by that. So examining the process of concretization of a technical object or of a lineage of technical objects is sort of like an existence proof of that thesis. So he wants to show what it means to say that technicity is prior to the constituted technical object by showing that genesis and showing the lineage of a technical object. So yeah, I think that's right. The whole third part is sort of making that theme explicit that was sort of implicit in the first part. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph then.
I can go if you like.
Sure, sounds good.
If we eliminate the idea of a dialectical relation between successive stages of the relation of man and the world, then what could be the motor of the successive splits in the course of which technicity appears? It is possible to appeal to Gestalt theory and to generalize the relation it establishes between figure and ground. Gestalt theory derives its basic principle from the holomorphic schema of ancient philosophy, supported by modern considerations of physical morphogenesis. The structuration of a system would depend on spontaneous modifications tending toward a state of stable equilibrium. However, in reality, it seems that it would be necessary to distinguish between a stable equilibrium and a metastable equilibrium. The emergence of the distinction between figure and ground is indeed the result of a state of tension, of the incompatibility of the system with itself, from what one could call the oversaturation of the system. But structuration is not the discovery of the lowest level of equilibrium. Stable equilibrium, in which all potential would be actualized, would correspond to the death of any possibility of further transformation, whereas living systems, those which precisely manifest the greater spontaneity of organization, are systems of metastable equilibrium. The discovery of a structure is indeed at the very least a provisional resolution of incompatibilities, but it is not the destruction of potentials. The system continues to live and evolve. It is not degraded by the emergence of structure. It remains under tension and capable of modifying itself.
All right, so this paragraph is again sort of a recap of what we saw last time. So first, the rejection of the dialectical model. So last time he pointed out the differentiation of his model of the differentiation of phases from dialectics, in that in his model there's no negative moments, there's no negativity as the motor of development, and there's no sort of necessary progression to the movement. So the phase doesn't necessarily lead to a further development. Yeah, and so 61 is put in the chat here. Phases replace dialectical moments. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. So each of the phases corresponds to a dialectical moment, but unlike the dialectical moments, they don't necessarily lead into each other because they don't have that. They don't have that linearity. And then he also suggests that in his model, there's not necessarily a split into two phases. You can have 2 or 4 or 10 or whatever different number of phases at each split. So in his schema that he's presented, it's always splitting into 2, but he doesn't, or he says that that's not necessary. That's, I guess, just a contingent fact of the way that the split has happened in history. Right, and so then after that, so he sort of calls back to that criticism of dialectics from the last section. And then he brings up the theory of form, or Gestalt theory. And then, so this is a criticism that he's also brought up before, and is developed further in the individuation book. But the point where he wants to differentiate himself from Gestalt theory is the notion of stable equilibrium, where Gestalt theory characterizes the form, or the good form, as something that is a stable equilibrium. So it compares the structuring of a perceptive scene into figure and ground. It compares that to a physical process of morphogenesis that results in a form, like the way a bubble forms in a spherical shape because of the surface tension. And so in doing so, in making that comparison, Gestalt theory treats the form as something that is a stable equilibrium. So it's a lowest state of potential energy, whereas Simondon wants to treat form as a metastable equilibrium. So it's a temporarily stable state, but it's not the lowest state of potential energy. It still contains potential energy that can be used to carry out work and to undergo further transformations. So yeah, this is something we've seen before, but just sort of a recap of what his criticism is.
It seems like he's juggling a few different approaches, but it doesn't seem like he's juggling. We perceive it as something totally original, like that's the way he writes. On the one hand, there's Gestalt theory used to apply to history. There is dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, and there is another figure, of course, Bergson, right, which we encountered in the last session. So it seems like there's a strange interplay between all these figures in the background.
Yes, I think that's right. That he has an interesting way of using other thinkers and sort of incorporating them into his own thought. This is partly related, I think, to his bad habit of not citing his sources. I think he a lot of times sort of takes on ideas from someone or another writer, and then sort of incorporates them, and then doesn't feel the need to actually cite that other writer, which makes things harder for us. But he does. Yeah, so he incorporates other thinkers into his own thought in a creative way, I would say, rather than just sort of adopting theses from someone else. And 61 I put in the chat here, and this was in relation to the process of formation of a metastable state, that it's kind of a contingent formal homeostasis. Yeah, I think so. He criticizes to some extent when he's talking about cybernetics. He criticizes the emphasis on homeostasis as so it's a related criticism. It's the idea that homeostasis produces or keeps an organism or a system at a certain state. It just maintains stability, but that doesn't account for the possibility of transformation that the system has if it's a living organism, for example. So a living organism is capable not just of maintaining itself in a certain state, but also of undergoing change. Of course, examples like a caterpillar undergoing a metamorphosis to become a butterfly, or you can find tons of different examples of that in the organic world. So yeah, to that extent, I think he would probably want to, or he probably wouldn't use the term homeostasis for the process he's describing, but it's sort of like almost like a second order homeostasis, or a more open form of homeostasis. So it's not preserving stability at sort of a lowest level, but preserving a stability that has openness for change built into it. That's sort of the structure of a life process for him. Okay, so we can go on to the next couple paragraphs. There's one short one and then one longer one, so I'll read them together. Where are we? Right. If one agrees to accept this corrective and replaces the notion of stability with that of metastability, it seems that Gestalt theory can account for the fundamental stages of the coming into being of the relation between man and the world. Primitive magical unity is the relation of the vital connection between man and the world, defining a universe that is at once subjective and objective prior to any distinction between the object and the subject, and consequently prior to any appearance of the separate object. One can conceive of the primitive mode of man's relation to the world as prior not only to the objectivation of the world, but even to the segregation of objective units in the field that will be the objective field. Man finds himself linked to a universe experienced as a milieu. The emergence of the object only occurs through the isolation and fragmentation of the mediation between man and the world, and according to the posited principle, this objectivation of a mediation must have as a correlative with respect to the primitive neutral center, the subjectivation of a mediation. The mediation between man and the world is objectivized as technical object, just as it is subjectivized as religious mediator. But this objectivation and subjectivation, which are opposition and complementarity, are preceded by an initial relation to the world, the magical stage, in which the mediation is not yet either subjectivized or objectivized, nor fragmented or universalized, and is only the simplest and most fundamental of structurations of the milieu of a living being, the birth of a network of privileged points of exchange between the being and the milieu.
It seems like there's a lot of like deeply psychological stuff going on in this paragraph, like going back from like object relations theory to kind of the primal scene, so to speak.
Yeah, he's so he is drawing on Gestalt psychology here, and one of the figures that he mentions in the individuation book, and possibly in this book as well, I can't remember, is Kurt Lewin, who I don't really know. I haven't read any of his works, but I know that he introduces the idea of relational fields, so like an objective field, and the perceptual field would be structured in different ways. So you have like a danger aspect of the field, or an aspect of attraction or whatever other. Anyway, you have a structured field which has different valences built into it. That's sort of the gist of it, as far as I understand it. And so I think that's sort of what he's pointing to in this paragraph. And the idea is that, or the sort of basic idea here is that the magical mode of existence precedes any separation between subject and object. So you just have this field, it's not subjective or objective. And then what structures that field, and he just introduces right in the last sentence, and we'll see further development of that, but it's the structure of that field is privileged points. So you have an organism in this field, and then there's privileged points within the fields that are that structure the field in relation to that organism. So we'll see further development of what that means later on. But that's, so magic is what precedes the differentiation between subjective and objective, is the basic point of this paragraph. And then maybe another comment would be that so he does point to so this process of subjectivation and objectivation, or these two complementary processes, are what produce technicity and religion, respectively. So the objectivation process produces technicity, and then the subjectivation process produces religion. But that's sort of an anticipation of what we're going to see later on. So for now, we're just staying at the level of the magical field with its privileged points, and we're going to see what that structuring consists in the next few paragraphs. Would someone else like to read?
I'll go again. The magical universe is already structured. but according to a mode prior to the segregation of object and subject. This primitive mode of structuration is one that distinguishes figure and ground by marking key points in the universe. If the universe were devoid of all structure, then the relation between the living being and its milieu could take place in a continuous time and a continuous space without any privileged moment or place. In fact, preceding the segregation of units, a reticulation of space and time that highlights privileged places and moments institutes itself as if all of man's power to act and all the world's ability to influence man were concentrated in these places and in these moments. These places and these moments keep hold of, concentrate, and express the forces contained in the ground, fond, of reality that supports them. These points and these moments are not separate realities. They draw their force from the ground they dominate, but they localize and focalize the attitude of the living vis-a-vis its milieu.
Right, so these privileged points are points in space and in time, as he's arguing here in this paragraph. So what we can think of here is religious sites, or I guess magical sites. So you have a certain location where you have to perform a magical ritual, for example, and then there's also often a time aspect that's associated with it. So whether it's like a new moon or whatever other the vernal equinox or something like that, there are often specific moments that are associated with magical rituals or performances. So we have these privileged points in space and in time, and that's what he's pointing to here. And the other aspects to point out in this paragraph would be that in these privileged points, the force or power, or however you want to describe it, of those privileged points in space and time is drawn from the ground. So the points constitute the form, but what makes them part of this sort of living mode of existence that is magic is that they draw their force from the ground, which sort of underlies those points. So they're not just sort of dots on a map or something like that. They're points that are active in some way. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph. I can read again. Okay. According to this general genetic hypothesis, we suppose that the primitive mode of existence of man in the world corresponds to a primitive union prior to any split of subjectivity and objectivity. The first structuration corresponding to the appearance of a figure and a ground in this mode of existence is the one that gives rise to the magical universe. The magical universe is structured according to the most primitive and meaningful of organizations, that of the reticulation of the world into privileged places and privileged moments. A privileged place, a place that has a power, is one that drains from within itself all the force and efficacy of the domain it delimits. It summarizes and contains the force of a compact mass of reality. It summarizes and governs it, as a high land governs and dominates a low land. The elevated peak is the lord of the mountain, just as the most impenetrable part of the woods is where all its reality resides. The magical world is thus made of a network of places and of things that have a power and that are bound to other things and other places that also have a power. This path, this enclosure, this temenos, contains all the force of the land, the key point of the reality and the spontaneity of things, as well as their availability. Actually, I'll continue with the next short paragraph that's tied to it. In such a network of key points, of high places, there is a primitive lack of distinction between human reality and the reality of the objective world. These key points are real and objective, but they are that by which the human being is immediately bound to the world, both in order to be influenced by it and in order to act upon it. They are points of contact and of mutual mixed reality, places of exchange and of communication, because they are formed from a knot between the two realities. So he gives some examples in this paragraph of what would constitute a privileged place. So he points to the peak of a mountain, the highest peak in a mountain range or in a hilly area, or the center, the densest region of a wood, of a forest. So these are privileged places in the sense that the domain around them is structured by that place, is oriented towards that place. I'm not familiar with the Greek word that he uses here, temenos. I don't know if anyone else has had a chance to look it up or knows what it means. Thank you, Liz Mason. Temenos is a piece of land cut off and assigned as an official domain, especially to kings and chiefs, or a piece of land marked off from common uses and dedicated to a god, a sanctuary, holy grove, or holy precinct. Yeah, that seems to fit with what he's pointing to here. Yeah, just a privileged piece of land that has a religious function, or a piece of the geography or the environment that has some role in magic and ritual and in the relationship between the human being and its environment. And in that second short paragraph at the bottom of 178, he points to the fact that these points form a network. So each point is sort of governs a region or dominates a region that surrounds it. But it also is related to the other points in some way that I guess we'll see further on how that network operates. But there's some connection between these points. They aren't just sort of isolated in their surrounding.
Just to draw a connection again to Heidegger, this sounds, similar somewhat to the to his concept of the fourfold, right? The sort of places that are kind of clearings that have sort of holy dimension in the sense of reaching out in a kind of transcendental way and yet being grounded from the earth and sort of starting like a sort of constitutive sort of spacing and temporalizing.
Yeah, the whole fourfold concept is, I think, one of the more obscure aspects of Heidegger's work. So I wouldn't be too confident in making a comparison, but I definitely see what you're pointing to is there's that the differentiation or the idea of the earth and some sort of production of or generation of a space that is sort of drawing from the earth. I think that's a similar type of motif as in Heidegger's texts that talk about the fourfold. So we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read.
I can go again. And magical thought comes first, since it corresponds to the simplest and most concrete, the most vast and flexible structuration, that of reticulation. Within the totality constituted by man and the world, a network of privileged points actualizing the insertion of human effort appears as an initial structure and through which the exchanges between man and the world take place. Each singular point concentrates within itself the capacity to command a part of the world that it specifically represents and whose reality it translates in communication with man. One could call these singular points the key points, commanding over the man-world relation in a reversible way, for the world influences man just as man influences the world. Such are the peaks of the mountain or certain naturally magical mountain passes because they govern a land. The heart of the forest, the center of a plain, are not only metaphorically or geometrically designed realities, they are realities that concentrate the natural powers as they focalize human effort. They are the figural structures in relation to the mass that supports them and constitutes their ground.
Right, and this is maybe connected to a note that I didn't read in one of the last paragraphs, where he points to. So it's on page 178. It's a note. So it's right after the phrase "the elevated peak is the lord of the mountain," and then the note reads, "Not metaphorically, but really. It is toward it that the geological folding orients itself, and the push that has edified the entire high plateau. The promontory is the firmest part of the chain eroded by the sea." So what he's pointing to here is that these points, these key points, are not they're not key just in sort of in an arbitrary sense. It's not like human beings just arbitrarily decide to pick certain points on a map, or geometrically divide up a country into regions or something like that. These are points that have a natural reality, and that the human being, the relationship of human beings to their environment is structured by these points that exist, that have this natural prominence or preeminence.
It's strange to I don't know. To me, this really, I really love this paragraph. I find that it sort of runs very deeply against the grain of understanding a place as named in a lot of ways, because it's really about these kind of invisible forces or intensities that concentrate into a place, and they're not, but they're not really localizable or something. They're more like a kind of parameterized intensity that after the fact we name, and that like the intellection of naming it would seem to like confuse or somehow obscure that sort of invisible intensity. I just think that that's like it's such an interesting paragraph for kind of indicating that.
Yeah, I would think the function of assigning a name to a place would be something that would appear later on in the Genesis, like maybe when we start to have theoretical knowledge later on, where you'd have some sort of geographical knowledge that would assign names to different places. But at this point of the Genesis, we just have this pre-subjective, pre-objective relationship between a human being and the environment that is structured by those points, and there's a sort of two-way interchange of the way that the human being acts on the environment, and then the environment also acts on the human being through these points.
I kind of hesitate to mention this, but it might be worthwhile to look into classical theories of habit or natural habit as well, and especially in this kind of in necessarily invertible relation of the access point, in which there's a structural role played by the relation of the person and their environment. Hexis in Aristotelian language, I think. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff, but it seems very much to cover this kind of idea of natural powers or dispositions that play this structural role.
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at that as well, so I'm not super confident on that. But I think, yeah, to my understanding, hexis in Aristotle has to do with it would be attributed to an individual being, whether it's an animal or a human being. So it's a property of that being, whereas what Simondon is pointing to here is a property of the relationship between the environment and the living being. So it's not, yeah. So it's in that environment, living being relationship that these properties arise, rather than in the living being itself. So that's I think a distinction between the Aristotelian and what Simondon is pointing to here. But I could be wrong about the way Aristotle uses that term.
Yeah, the writing surrounding Aristotelian hexis is a little bit strange because of the way that we understand dispositions in contemporary philosophy, I think. But I think that it's still probably a promising way to kind of get to the deeper question. But I don't know, I can't really point anyone in a specific direction besides possibly Felix Reveson. Yeah, I'm kind of hesitant to do that as well, but I do think that he means hexis in a certain kind of way in which it necessarily intersects with the world, and kind of provides the basis for kind of like a primitive locality. I'm not sure though. I don't know. I'd have to go look at it again.
Yeah, it would be worth looking at that and making the comparison, whether there is that contrast I was pointing to or not. It would be interesting to establish that more clearly and make the distinction. And Burke has posted in the chat here that there could be, I think there could be some resonance between key points and certain other non-European conceptions of space, I've been thinking of feng shui and Chinese geomancy. My knowledge is limited, though. Yes, my knowledge is probably even more limited than yours. I only know the most basic sort of concept of what feng shui is. But yeah, that's an interesting suggestion because, yeah, so it does involve some sort of idea of a structuring of space in terms of something like energy or power flowing through space. And so there's different, each direction has a certain relation to different types of energy, and the layout of a room or a house or a building or whatever it is structures the way the energy flows through that space. And so it would be interesting to for someone who knows feng shui better than I do, to be able to make that comparison and see to what extent it sort of maps on to what Simondon is describing here. Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion.
I just want to throw in, based on the conversations, the kind of ways that 61 and Burke are sort of mentioning things. Also, the work of George Canguilhem comes to mind. The way that he sort of talks about living beings and their milieu. I guess, or I think that Simondon was either a student of Canguilhem or was influenced by him or something like that. And so that seems like it would be maybe another reference point worth mentioning here.
Yeah, Canguilhem is actually mentioned in the preface to this book as having lent Simondon some rare German books that he couldn't get a hold of otherwise. So they obviously had a pretty good working relationship, and so yeah, he's definitely drawing on his work as well. Though I'm not I'm not that familiar with Canguilhem. I think I've only read one of his books. Did you want to say something, 61?
No, I was going to, but I thought better of it. I was just looking at this Aristotle stuff about it. There's this stuff that makes me laugh, kind of. I don't know, some of the ways that he describes things. Like it's like clearly it's impossible to have a having. So maybe it's lost in translation a little bit or something, but I find that kind of language kind of humorous. Like this kind of like really investigating what is the having? Can we have a having? Like, is this like an allowable circularity in reference? I don't know. There's just some funny aspects of this whole problem.
Yeah, I think some stuff does get lost in translation, particularly with different tenses of the verb, which, like from Greek to English, they don't sort of map onto each other in a one-to-one way. There's like, different tenses, and Aristotle's categories that he uses are pretty closely drawn from the verb tenses of ancient Greek. So it's it makes things difficult for translators. But coming back to the text, but those were interesting digressions. But yeah, we can come back to the text and look at, where are we? Yes, okay. So I can read the next paragraph. When seeking to identify the remnants of magical thought in the context of the current conditions of life, we usually look at superstition as an example of the schemas of magical thought. Superstitions are, in fact, merely a degraded vestige of magical thought, and can only mislead the search for its true essence. One ought, on the contrary, to refer to high, noble, and sacred forms of thought, requiring a fully enlightened effort in order to understand the sense of magical thought. Such is, for example, the affective, representative, and voluntary foundation that supports an ascent or an exploration. The desire for conquest and a sense of competition are perhaps a part of the motivation that enables one to go from common existence to these exceptional acts. But what is mostly at stake, when one invokes the desire for conquest, is to legitimize an individual act for a community. In fact, the thought at work in the individual or the small group of those who realize an exceptional act is much more primitive and far richer. So this is an interesting point here, where he wants to distinguish magical thought from superstition, which might be sort of a tempting first comparison to make, the idea that that magical thought would consist in superstition, but he sees that as a sort of degraded form of magical thought rather than sort of an essential form of magical thought. And then he's pointing to the project of climbing a mountain as something that we should use instead as our example of what magical thought consists in. And he relates this to so this phrase to legitimize an individual act for a community. That's an interesting one. So it has the idea that by conquering a mountain or by climbing a mountain, you sort of incorporate it into the community. So this maybe points back to what I was describing earlier from the other book about the sage, how the sage incorporates a portion of natural reality into the community through their knowledge. So it's a similar, I think, type of process at work here, where this conquest of a mountain or whatever natural environment sort of incorporates it into the community in a certain way.
Like George Mallory, who said he climbed Everest because it was there.
Right. I thought that was Edmund Hillary, but I may
be.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Sorry, just you maybe read it. Maybe Edmund Hillary. I'm not sure.
Well, either way, it doesn't really matter who it was. But yeah, that's a famous quote that yeah. So because this mountain is there, because the landscape is structured by this peak, therefore human beings have to conquer it in order to incorporate it into their community. And so this is what he points to as being sort of the essence of magical thought. And so it's interesting. So this draws back also to what we were talking about earlier about how magical thought is not exhausted by that split into technicity and religion that happens later on. So there's still some element of magical thought that remains even after that split. So even in our contemporary world, we still have this element of magical thought that is present in this conquest of nature, conquest of these privileged points within nature.
Can we take this cosmological, maybe? Are there planets that are like key points? For instance, Mars is much more of a key point than a humanly uninhabitable place. I don't know, because this makes me think of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy a bit, and there is a central argument between two characters. One of them is for terraforming Mars, saying this is for human consciousness, and the other one is a geologist who strictly opposes this line of thinking. But the first one wins at the end, speaking in favor of human consciousness, the Mars being there for terraforming.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. So it seems like Simondon is sort of limiting his conceptualization of these privileged points to the terrestrial surface. But I don't see any reason why you couldn't expand this to other planets and like look at the solar system as a system that is structured by privileged points. And then, yeah, Mars could very well be a privileged point if there are certain properties of Mars that make it amenable to terraforming in some distant future, presumably. Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion. I don't see any reason why not.
I think Simondon is trying to at least it's my take here that he's trying to point at something that's necessarily a much broader conception than any of a kind of particular location of reference. I don't think that kind of fits what he's trying to get at with magic as this kind of primal unity. Like, if sure we have places that might have symbolic value, but that could be understood not as essentially magical, but related to a kind of subsequent category of development. I think. I don't know. I just hesitate to take this broad of a conception of magical objects, which are kind of objects of almost like religious fascination, as though they would be magical, because I think there might be like a possible conflation there that could be harmful in understanding his system more broadly, I guess. Whereas it does seem like he's pointing to something which, in its very primitive, almost phenomenal way, is a structural correspondence between the subject and the object, which is an implicit structural correspondence. And here, I think it's kind of not sensible to refer to like objects of like religious fascination necessarily, as much as something which is like more deeply fundamental than that, which could be kind of like an ex post facto um, naming or kind of recognition of something, which I think he's trying to get at, like in a more implicit, primitive basis. I don't know, though. That's just my impression.
Yeah, I think that's a useful reminder that we might have a tendency to conflate magic and religion in particular, especially in a sort of secular-ish world. In most of the Western worlds, there's yeah, I think we can maybe have a tendency to conflate religion and magic in a way that Simondon doesn't want to do. So we need to be careful to keep in mind that magic sort of precedes that subject-object split, and it's always related to natural properties of the environment and the relationship of the living being to that environment.
Sorry, I know that's somehow less fun, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's still compatible with the idea of the solar system having a structure of this sort as well. In the same way that you can conquer a mountain, you can conquer Mars. So obviously, the technical means for conquering Mars would come much later in this genetic process of development. But the sort of subjective or pre-subjective relationship of the living being to Mars as part of their environment is something that would still obtain, I think. But yeah, I could be wrong. Maybe we can continue and learn more about this mountain climbing as an instance of magical thought, if someone would like to read the next paragraph.
I can. The ascent, the exploration, and more generally any pioneering gesture consists in connecting with the key points that nature presents. To climb a slope in order to go towards the summit is to make one's way towards the privileged place that commands the entire mountain chain, not in order to dominate or possess it, but in order to exchange a relationship of friendship with it. Man and nature are not strictly speaking enemies before this connection at this key point, but are simply strangers to each other. For as long as it hasn't been climbed, the summit is merely a summit, a place that is higher than the others. The ascent gives it the character of a place that is richer and fuller and not abstract, a place through which this exchange between the world and man comes to pass. The summit is the place from which the entire mountain chain is seen in an absolute manner, whereas all the sights from all the other places are relative and incomplete, arousing the desire for the view from the summit. An expedition or navigation allowing one to reach a continent by a definite route do not conquer anything, and yet they are valid according to magical thought, because they allow one to make contact with this continent in a privileged place that is a key point. The magical universe is made of a network of access points to each domain of reality, thresholds, summits, limits, and crossing points, attached to each other through their singularity and their exceptional character.
Right. So yeah, thanks for reading that, and feel free to get on the mic if you have any comments, or to post them in the chat as well, and we can read them in. Yeah, so this is further expanding on this idea of the conquest of nature and what that means. And so he wants to distinguish between this conquest aspect of say climbing a mountain and something like domination of nature. And so this climbing a mountain is not dominating it, but it's a pretty strong term I think he uses here, and he describes it as a relationship of friendship with the mountain, which is a pretty interesting suggestion. And so yeah, so human being and nature are not enemies. There isn't this sort of domination relationship where either nature dominates human beings or human beings dominate nature, but they start off as strangers, and then by reaching this key point, whether it's the summit of a mountain or the center of a forest or whatever it is, by reaching that point, human beings are able to enter into this relationship of friendship with the environment, which I think is a really interesting idea. And he even he actually sort of goes back on that or he qualifies that term of conquests that he had used earlier. So he says that an expedition or navigation don't conquer anything, but they still have this magical value in the sense that they permit to reach a continent at a certain privileged point or a key point. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph and I can read. This network of limits is not only spatial but also temporal. There are remarkable dates, privileged moments to begin this or that action. Moreover, the very notion of a beginning is magical, even if all particular value is denied to the date of the beginning. The beginning of an action that is meant to last, the first act in a long series of actions, would not in themselves have any majesty or any particular power of direction if they weren't considered as governing the duration of the action as well as the rest of the successful or unsuccessful efforts. Dates are privileged points in time, allowing an exchange between human intention and the spontaneous unfolding of events. Man's insertion into natural coming into being is carried out by way of these temporal structures, just as the influence of natural time is exerted on every human life as it becomes the destined end. So we've been talking primarily about spatial points so far, and then here he's introducing the idea of temporal points. So in many systems of magic, there is particular moments that certain acts have to be carried out in order for the magical process to be successful. Like it has to be at the new moon, or it has to be done at midnight, or it's in relation to certain astrological signs or events. So yeah, there's this temporal structure. The time is structured by these moments that have a particular valence, that a certain act has to be done in conjunction with a certain moment in time. And then the next concept that he introduces, or the next idea that he introduces here, is the idea that the beginning as such is magical, even if separately from any sort of system of magical thought that involves this relation to temporal points of these outstanding moments. So what this brings to mind for me is like the cornerstone of a building, where often if it's like sort of a public building, you'll have a cornerstone that's like sort of ceremonially laid by the mayor or some other public official, and there'll be some sort of ceremony marking the beginning of the construction of this building, and so that something like that, it has this sort of magical structure in that it makes this beginning of the process into a special event that is distinct from all the other stones that are laid in the building, and it privileges this one point as the beginning of the process. And I think just looking at the next paragraph, I think we're going to see more about that. So if someone would like to read.
I can go. In current civilized life, vast institutions are concerned with magical life. but they are hidden by way of utilitarian concepts that justify them indirectly. In particular, official holidays, celebrations, and vacations, which compensate with their magical charge for the loss of magical power that civilized urban life imposes on us. Thus, holiday trips or vacations, which are considered ways for procuring rest and distraction, are in fact a search for old or new key points. These points can be the big city for the country dweller or the countryside for the urbanite, but it is more generally not just any point of the city or countryside. It is the shore or the high mountain, or else the border one crosses in order to arrive into a foreign land. The dates of public holidays are relative to privileged moments in time. Sometimes there can be an encounter between the singular moments and the singular points. I'll just get this small one out of the way as well. Everyday time and space, in turn, serves as the ground to these figures. Dissociated from the ground, the figures would lose their signification. Holidays and celebrations are not simply a time of rest with respect to current life, through a halting of current life, but rather a search for the privileged places and dates in relation to the continuous ground.
So yeah, this is something that pretty much every society has holidays or festivals or whatever you want to call it that happen on a certain date or at certain times, whether it's in relation to the seasons or astrological phenomena or whatever it is. So even when they aren't magical in like a strict sense, they don't have a relation to a system of magical thought. They have this broader magical value in the sense that they're relating human existence to this temporal structure of privileged moments in time, and then those privileged moments play the role of the figure in relation to everyday time, the rest of the time that is not the holiday or the festival, and though the everyday time plays the role of the ground. And so Laith Mason puts in the chat here, reminds me a bit of Arendt's concept of natality in these past couple paragraphs. That would be something that you would have to expand on because I'm not very familiar with Arendt.
Just that like human laboring and human work and the possibility of freedom by shucking off the kind of drudgery of work is something where there's always a kind of contingent aspect of it that where it might happen as an event and it's always possible, right? So hence like the use of the term natality, that there's that there's always a possibility of a new beginnings or the introduction of novelty into the world, like through just the concept feels somewhat connected to what Simondon is saying here.
Yeah, that makes sense. That would be something worth looking into and seeing if you can sort of draw out that connection. The other point I was going to bring up is this idea of the holiday in our contemporary society that he's pointing to here, where the holiday doesn't necessarily take the form of rest. So it's not that so of course you're not going to work on your holidays, but you might, if you go on a holiday, if you go on one of these tours where you visit like 10 cities in 12 days or something like that, you might be more busy on your holidays than you are at work in your everyday life. So it's not rest in that sense. It's you're sort of putting yourself into these privileged points, whether it's these cities or the high mountains or archaeological sites or whatever it is, some sort of tourist attraction that has this power over its surroundings, and you sort of gain that power by putting yourself into that site. Yeah, so that's an interesting, I guess, corrective to our sort of general idea of the holiday as being about rest from work. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph, and I will read. The figural structure in primitive magical thought is inherent to the world. It is not detached from it. It is the reticulation of the universe into privileged key points through which the exchanges between the living thing and its milieu come to pass. Now, it is precisely this particular structure that is phase shifted when one passes from the original magical unity to technics or religion. Figure and ground separate by detaching themselves from the universe to which they adhered. The key points objectivize themselves and only retain their functional characteristics of mediation. They become instrumental, mobile, capable of efficacy in any place and in any moment whatsoever. As a figure, the key points, detached from the ground whose key they are, become technical objects, transportable and abstracted from the milieu. At the same time, the key points lose their mutual reticulation and their power of influence from a distance on the reality that surrounded them. As technical objects, they have action only through contact, point by point, instant by instant. This rupture of the network of key points frees the characteristics of ground, which, in their turn, detach themselves from their own narrowly qualitative and concrete ground in order to hover over the whole universe, the entirety of space and throughout all of duration, in the form of detached powers and forces above the world. While the key points objectivize themselves in the form of concretized tools and instruments, the ground powers subjectivize themselves by personifying themselves in the form of the divine and the sacred, God, heroes, priests. Small translation point here is that in the French text, it says gods, plural, not God, singular. But I don't think it makes a huge difference to the meaning of the passage.
It sounds like a significant difference.
I think here it has to do with the sort of historical period that he has in mind when he talks about religion, separated out from the magical thought. I think he's thinking of like ancient Greek religion, for example. So is obviously a polytheistic religion in which there are many gods, and then so the divine and the sacred within ancient Greek religion takes the form of many gods and many sacred places, rather than in monotheistic religions where you'd have one god and a structure with, well, maybe not one sacred place, but like a most sacred place in distinction to less sacred places.
So, yeah, he's doing something like a philosophical theogonia, as in Hesiod's work, that accounts for the birth of the gods.
Yeah, I think that's right. He wants to explain, the gods and other religious figures of the divine and the sacred are a result of that subjectivation of the previous magical relationship to the environment. And so he gives a genealogy of where gods come from in human reality. And then the other side of that differentiation is the technical object as the objectivation of that relationship to reality in the magical mode of being. So what distinguishes the technical object from the magical site is the fact that it's not the technical object is not tied to a certain place and time. It's movable. You can whether it's like a hammer or whatever other technical object, you can use it anywhere and any time. It's not tied to a particular place and time in the way that a magical relationship to the environment is. Would someone else like to read the next paragraph?
I could go. The primitive reticulation of the magical world is thus the source of opposing objectivation and subjectivation. At the moment of rupture of the initial structuration, the fact that the figure detaches itself from the ground is translated by another detachment. Figure and ground detach themselves from their concrete adherence to the universe and follow opposite paths. The figure fragments itself while the qualities and forces of the ground universalize themselves. This parceling out and this universalization are, for the figure, ways of becoming an abstract figure, and for the ground, a unique abstract ground. This phase shift of mediation into figural characteristics and characteristics of ground translates the appearance of a distance between man and the world. The mediation itself, rather than being a simple structuration of the universe, takes on a certain density. It objectivizes itself in techniques and subjectivizes itself in religion, leading to the appearance of the first object in the technical object and of the first subject in divinity, and there was hitherto only a unity of the living and its media. Objectivity and subjectivity appear between the living and its media, between man and the world, at a moment when the world does not yet have a complete status of object, nor man a complete status of subject. One can furthermore note that objectivity is never completely coextensive with the world, any more than subjectivity is completely coextensive with man. It is only when the world is viewed from a technicist perspective and man from a religious perspective that it appears that one can be said to be entirely object and the second entirely subject. Pure objectivity and pure subjectivity are modes of mediation between man and the world in their initial form.
So we had before we had this primitive unity of the human being and their environment, and then now we have this split where we have subject and object appear. So the initial figure of the subject is the divinity, and then the initial figure of the object is the technical object. So religion is the side of the subjectivity, and it's the universal subjectivity. So I think that's why it's a divinity is the first figure of subjectivity here, because it's rather than being the human subject, which is particular in various ways, it's a divinity which is universal.
So it's not a human being that is the first subject. A human being we can imagine as talking to themselves in their heads, their minds, or hallucinating talking to themselves.
Yeah, so it's this is a particular notion of subjectivity that I guess a more traditional notion of subjectivity would put the human being as the first subject. So yeah, that's precisely in sort of inner dialogue or thinking about yourself would be sort of the principle of subjectivity. But here, Simondon was pointing to the divinity as the first form of subjectivity. So this would be something that is not limited to one individual human being, and also incorporates an aspect of the environment, because the divinity, as we saw in the last paragraph, the divinity is a result of these privileged places in the magical mode of thought. So there's something retained of that extra human element in the divinity as the first figure of subjectivity.
That makes sense.
And so I think, concretely, it means that we can't conceive of subjectivity arising in an isolated human being, which I think in more traditional accounts would sort of allow for that possibility. In this account, subjectivity develops only in a community that has these relationships, this magical relationship to its environment, and it's only through this phase shift or dephasing of this relationship that you can develop subjectivity.
This is maybe not a thread worth pursuing because we're talking specifically about Simondon, but it does sort of remind me of the barbarian despotic machine in Anti-Oedipus. It feels like a sort of shift in a kind of signifying regime or something like that would be another way to think about it.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion to look into. Again, that's something that I haven't read in a little while, so it would be I wouldn't be too confident in making that comparison. But I guess in the sense that it introduces a new system of signification. This phase shift that brings about the separation between religion and technicity, it introduces this new system of signification that is structured by the relationship to this divinity, the divinity as the universal subject. Yeah, so it's you can distinguish between a system of sense in the magical mode of existence that's structured by the key points, and then a system of sense in the religious mode of existence that's structured by the divinity. And then there's this sort of phase shift between them.
Yeah, exactly. It's very well described.
Okay, so we have, I think, about 2 more big paragraphs before the end of this section, so it's probably going to be a good place for us to stop once we get there for today. Would someone like to read the next paragraph?
I can go again. So we're at Technics and Religion, is that right? Or the organization?
Yeah, that's right.
Technics and religion are the organization of 2 symmetrical and opposed mediations, but they form a couple because they are each only a phase of the primitive mediation. In this sense, they possess no definitive autonomy. What's more, even taken in the system they form, they cannot be considered as enclosing all of the real, since they are between man and the world, but do not contain all of the reality of man and world, and cannot apply to it in a complete way. Directed by the gap that exists between the 2 opposite aspects of mediation, science and ethics deepen the relation between man and the world. With respect to science and ethics, the 2 primitive mediations play a normative role. Science and ethics are born in the space defined by the gap between technics and religion, following a median direction. The direction exercised by the precedents of technics and of religion before science and ethics is of the same order as that exerted by the lines limiting an angle on the bisector of that angle. The sides of the angle can be indicated by short segments, while the bisector can be indefinitely extended. In the same way, on the basis of the gap between very primitive techniques and religion, a very elaborate science and ethics can progressively be constructed that is guided rather than limited by the basic conditions of techniques and religion.
So this comparison with the angle and the bisector doesn't seem very illuminating to me, but maybe I'm wrong. But I guess the idea is that you can define an angle using just short segments, A, B, C, and then when you bisect the angle, you can extend that bisector as long as you want.
So that relation between techniques and religion predefines the possible shapes any science and ethics can take in their own historicity.
Yeah, I'm not sure predefines is the right word, but it forms the basis of that relationship. Because the reason why I say that predefines might not be the right word is because it seems that he's allowing for a certain creativity of each of these modes of existence with respect to what comes before. So it's not the case that the state of techniques and of religion sort of leads to necessarily leads to a certain kind of ethics and a certain kind of sorry, what's the other one? Ethics and science. It's not that techniques and religion have this sort of intrinsic determination that produces science and ethics that correspond to them. Ethics and science have their own sort of creativity that is grounded in what comes before, but is not fully determined by them.
Yeah, I see your point. I think that might be why he's saying it is guided rather than limited.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the choice of words there. So guided by that gap means that there's a certain creativity or flexibility that is inherent in that relationship. So there's a certain amount of it's not a full determination of one level by the one that precedes it. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph, and I can read, and this will be our last one for today. The origin of the split that has given rise to technical thought and religious thought can be attributed to a truly functional primitive structure of reticulation. This split has separated figure and ground, the figure giving the content of technics and the ground that of religion. While in the magical reticulation of the world, figure and ground are reciprocal realities, technics and religion appear when figure and ground detach themselves from one another, thereby becoming mobile, fragmentable, displaceable, and directly manipulable because they are not bound to the world. Technical thought retains only the schematism of structures, of that which makes up the efficacy of action on the singular points. These singular points, detached from the world whose figure they are, also detached from one another, losing their immobilizing reticular concatenation, become capable of being fragmented and available, as well as reproducible and constructible. The elevated place becomes an observation post, a watchtower built on the plain, or a tower placed at the entrance of a gorge. Often, a nascent technique need go no further than modifying a privileged place, as when constructing a tower on the summit of a hill, or by placing a lighthouse on a promontory at the most visible point. But techniques can also completely create the functionality of privileged points. It merely retains the figural power of the natural realities, not the placement and natural localization on a ground that is determined and given prior to any human intervention. Fragmenting the schematisms more and more, it turns the thing into a tool or an instrument, in other words, a detached fragment of the world, capable of operating efficiently and at any place, and under any conditions, point by point, according to the intention directing it and the moment man wants it. The availability of the technical thing consists in being liberated from the enslavement to the ground of the world. Technics is analytical, operating progressively and through contact, setting aside the liaison through influence. In magic, the singular place enables action on a domain in its entirety, just as it suffices to speak to the king in order to win over an entire people. On the contrary, in techniques, the whole of reality must be traversed, touched, and treated by the technical object, detached from the world and applicable to any point and at any moment. The technical object distinguishes itself from the natural being in the sense that it is not part of the world. It intervenes as mediator between man and the world. It is, in this respect, the first detached object, since the world is a unity, a media rather than an ensemble of objects. There are, in fact, three types of reality: the world, the subject, and the object, which is intermediary between the world and the subject, whose initial form is that of the technical object. And there's a note here from the editor saying there's a variation in the proofs, which reads, there are in fact three types of reality: the world, man, and the object, intermediary between the world and man, whose first form is the technical object. Yeah, there's not a lot of difference between those two forms, so I'm not sure why they felt the need to inform us of the variation. So in this paragraph, he's expanding on what he had introduced earlier about the idea of the technical object as being detachable from the environment in a way that the magical privilege point is not. And so that's what constitutes the technical object as an object. It's something that is distinct from the world, and it plays the role of a mediator between the human being and the world. So you act on the world through the technical object, whether it's a hammer or a saw or whatever it is, and that action is localized in a way that the privilege point is not. So the privilege point dominates or rules over an area, whereas the technical object can only operate at the one location that it is. Yeah, and so there's a sort of progressive detachment of the technical object from the environment. There's more and more possibility for the technical objects to operate at any place and any time.
Just given where we started today, I think it does kind of make sense to have the footnote to say that if the original magical unity was between man and world, and then through that process of mediation that you've just described, there's subjectivation and objectivation, then then it does feel like Simondon is making or someone's making a useful correction here to say it should be subject at this point rather than man.
Yeah, that's right. I hadn't noticed that they substituted subject rather than man in the final form. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so if there are no other comments on this last section, we can, or on the last paragraph, I mean, we can end here a little bit early for this week, but I think we should probably stop at the point before I think we should stop here before going on to the next section. So I will stop the recording and we can meet again the same time next week, and we'll start with section 3.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Sounds good. See you next week.